last video I did on iris rods or camera rods or whatever you want to call them, I looked at the basics of what the rod standards are and how they all work. This time I'm going to look at how I built out the rods for this setup on my R5C and my new primary video lens, the Canon RF24-105 f2.8L IS USM Z. Before I get all of this, if there's one thing that has become clear in this whole process to me, it's that there is no one right solution to this task. So my aim here isn't to tell you what you need to do or just show you the certain parts that you're going to need. My aim here is to show you how I kitted out my rig, talk about the pros and cons of the parts that I came into and used, and some of the process that I went through to get there. Also, just to get it out of the way, because this is that kind of thing, all of the products that you're going to see me talking about in this video were bought by me. I have not received anything from anybody in terms of sponsored stuff or anything like that. This is my research and my money going into my setup. Now, one of the big discussion points in the previous video was whether or not you should even bother with a rod setup like this. And I decided to do this for basically 3 reasons. First, I have been looking at doing this for years, and I have stayed away from doing it for years simply because of the cost and the complexity and the fact that I couldn't figure out if this had to go with that or what I needed for this and all of that kind of thing. That said, with 2 years of maybes and should I's and, oh, that's cool and I want, but not doing it, I figured it was at least worth trying to do something as long as I could keep the costs down to see how things shake out. After all, we all know in theory and practice are the same thing, but in practice, that's not necessarily true. And this is a case where actually putting metal to the road, so to speak, or rubber to the road, so to speak, and using it will tell me a lot more than thinking about how I could possibly use it. Second, my primary video lens has also changed recently. Up until now, I have used a Canon 24-70mm, an RF 24-70mm f2.8L, and I recently got their RF 24-105mm f2.8L, the Z lens. So this created a rather more convoluted situation for mounting my camera to my teleprompter and sort of dealing with things in shooting video in general. And while it certainly works and you don't need rods to go with it, the fact that it is an internal zoomed lens and I wanted to try it, you know, that would at least give me something out of that. Moreover, using the lens's small lens hood often meant that when I'm shooting at my normal 30 to 45 millimeter focal length, which I use for most of these videos, I would get a lot of undesired flare from lights just out of the frame, like the side light that's over there lighting me. Now, to combat this, I wanted to use my matte box, which is big enough that ideally it can be mounted to, or it should be mounted to rods and not the camera's lens, and then use that to filter out that glare that's impacting the footage I'm shooting. And finally, the third point here is that while my teleprompter has done its job and done it well, it is big and heavy and hard to transport easily and difficult to set up, and there's a whole laundry list of things that you end up with if you've ever bought a cheap teleprompter and you know how that goes about. So I have been looking for, or probably to build, a smaller, lighter option that folds down more easily so that I can transport it and use it without having to carry around a whole big bag and a whole bunch of crap. And since teleprompters go to the front of the lens and they're pretty heavy, even if you make them out of carbon fiber, this seemed like a good reason or place to leverage these kinds of rods to support instead of worrying about or wasting or hanging that thing off of the lens. So with my reasoning out of the way, the camera and lens at the core of this look like this. I have removed the lens's lens foot, mostly to clear the quick release plate that I am using on the bottom of the camera. So this is a really right stuff. Acra Swiss to Manfrotto quick release, or Manfrotto video style quick release plate. And we will talk about more of this later. And partly I removed the lens foot because the lens is not supporting everything or anything anymore, and it cuts down a little bit of weight. Now, I should note, if you are using this lens, Canon sells a lens holder mount that is specifically intended for attaching this lens and the RF70-200 f2.8L IS USM Z in a rod setup or to a rod setup like this. It's part number LH-E1. And it's ridiculously expensive at $240 for a tiny piece of machined aluminum and a screw. In short, I'm not planning on buying one of those anytime soon. So that's the camera. Now, the heart of any rod setup is the base plate. And I've looked hard at options that are out there. And eventually what I settled on is Tilta's 15mm LWS Acra Manfrotto dual base plate. And I got mine in black because the gray looked too gray. Now, what I like about this base plate, or at least I did in concept, was that dual QR system design. The fortunate reality is I didn't fully think through the compatibility situation that it would have, and to be honest, that's the biggest problem that I have with it. Now, on my cameras, I use, or at least on my R5s, I use really right stuff L plates. And on my R5C, I have a SmallRig black Mamba cage. And both of these have Acra Swiss style plates or clamps or dovetails on the bottom, but none of them actually work with this base plate's Acra Swiss dovetail side. Now, in the case of the really right stuff plates, the simple reality is they are too wide to fit in the dovetail in the base plate. This is because, at least as far as I can tell, there is no actual defined standard for Acra Swiss style double dovetail plates. By convention, they're all about 1.5 inches or 38 millimeters wide, but there is a whole lot of variance in both the width and even the depth of those dovetails. Really right stuff plates are made exactly 1.5 inches or 38.1 millimeters wide. However, DJI, who also uses this standard, and many other brands, their plates end up being 38 millimeters wide. And in fact, I measured some that are even narrower than that. Now, this isn't a problem if you were using a screw-type clamp on a regular tripod head, but the fixed width track that is in this base plate, well, the plate has to fit in that, and there's no adjustment if it doesn't. Now, simultaneously, there's also that Manfrotto 501 style track, and that runs through the middle of the Acra Swiss plate as well. And in fact, both the Acra Swiss and Manfrotto tracks or plates have to be a certain minimum length to work in this mount. Short plates, like the DJI one that comes with your gimbal as the upper quick release plate, won't actually work at all. They're just too short, and they don't fit in the dovetails with the Manfrotto dovetail cutting it in half. In fact, the same thing is true for the Peak Design Capture Clamps plate, which works in tons of different places, but not here. It's just not long enough. And this brings me, speaking of not long enough, or too long, to the cage on my R5C. It fits in the dovetails. That's good. And it's wide enough to span the gap from the Manfrotto plate in the middle. However, because the back of the grip side flares out on SmallRig cages, it's not quite wide enough to center the lens in the center of the Tilta base where it's supposed to be. Now, the error is not huge, but it is enough that it can be problematic. Now, the good news in all of this is that the Manfrotto side works way better. I tried every Manfrotto 501 style plate that I have, from genuine Manfrottos to SmallRigs to DJIs to even some generic ones that I have no idea where I got them from, and every single one of them worked in this clamp. The only real problem that I ran into are that short plates, like this 80 millimeter long one, it will work but it is so short that you have to be careful that you center it properly or it won't engage with both dovetails and stay locked in place. But once it's locked in place, it seems to be fine. Now, that said, one thing to be aware of with these style of clamps is that while DJI has adopted that Manfrotto 501 style for their gimbals, and therefore there are a ton of plates out there designed for these for DJI gimbals, the style of the plates are slightly different in how the ends are configured and where cuts and bevels are made. Now, this doesn't stop you from using DJI plates or Manfrotto plates or anything like that, but it can limit which direction you can insert the plate, or it may require you to remove the safety stop from the Tilta base, which just requires a hex key to take it out. Now, finally, while I'm talking about the Tilta base, let's talk about vertical offsets a little. Based on my measurements, the center of the 15mm rods are 23mm below the surface or the bottom surface of this clamp. In the case of my R5C, the lens sits 44.7mm above the bottom surface of the camera. So for the standard 85mm height that's part of the 15mm LWS standard, that leaves 17.3mm for your cage, its dovetails, the quick release plate, and whatever else that you have to use to get it spot on. Now, the Really Right Stuff adapter that I'm using here adds 16.67mm to the stack up. You can get slightly thinner ones. I think SmallRig's is a little bit thinner. And the SmallRig cage on the bottom of my camera is 10.23mm for a total of 26.9mm of additional stick or stack between the top of the Acros or the Tilta base and the bottom of the camera. Or put this another way, the setup that I'm using here puts the lens's center 9.6mm above where it should be for the 15mm LWS standard. Now, even if I could use the Acra Swiss dovetail on this cage or this base plate, it still wouldn't be perfect. It would actually put the lens's center 13mm below the height that it's supposed to be at. Now, in practice, I haven't found this to be an issue because most things have adjustability, and 15mm is within the range of at least the adjustability of my SmallRig matte box. Now, I was a little bothered by this Tilta base. Specifically, I kind of thought it was silly that I had to have a quick release clamp, adapter clamp, and so on and so forth. So I tried another option. I picked up a SmallRig universal 15mm rail support baseplate. It's part number DBC2272B in SmallRig's catalog. To make a long story short here, I immediately found it unsatisfactory for my use and returned it. Now, to be clear, this is not because it's poorly made or poorly designed or the fat part that I got was broken or anything like that. It was very well made for, what it is. But I ran into 3 issues that ended up being major problems for me that you might want to be aware of if you're kind of going into this. First, I found it lacked the rigidity that I was looking for in this kind of a rig as a whole. With the camera and lens clamped to the plate, there was nearly a 1/4 inch of droop at the front of the lens compared to where the camera was. So it sunk down. Now, with the Tilta plate that I'm using, it's dead straight. There is no droop at all. Now, that alone isn't necessarily deal breaking. You can deal with it. Lift this lens up when you put it in a matte box, that kind of thing. And with smaller and lighter lenses, and specifically shorter lenses than what I'm using, that probably wouldn't be a problem at all, period. But it was one problem. Second was the way their screw clamp worked. So while it does use a screw clamp, and therefore it works with any Acra Swiss style plate, the clamp uses sort of a lever style handle, not a knob style one. And again, for most people, this isn't going to be an issue. In fact, I checked with my R5 Mark II, and it clears the back just fine, even with the battery grip. So that's not really a problem for most people. However, if you are shooting with an R5C, well, its cooling solution sticks out behind the camera, pushes the LCD back. And this style of lever handle hits it. Now, again, this isn't a complete deal breaker. The handle can be repositioned. You pull out on it, you turn it to where you want, you push it back in, it sits into a different part of a nut and you turn it and so forth. But it did mean that tightening and loosening the clamp was an incredibly frustrated process where I had to go through like a quarter turn, reposition the handle, quarter turn. I didn't really want to do that. Finally, and this isn't specific to this SmallRig base plate, but true using any Arca Swiss style plate as a whole. While using an Arca Swiss style plate sounds like a great idea. It's what you already have on your hybrid camera. So why would you need to have something else? In practice, it turns out to be more of a problem than I actually expected. Using a Manfrotto plate on the Tilta base, I can turn one knob, loosen the clamp on my matte box, and just slide the camera out of the rig like this. I can then just put that in my bag and take the rig apart and do whatever I need to do with that. With the Arca Swiss plate, even using the Arca Swiss plate or on my adapter plate in my current setup, I can't just release the camera and pull it out of the rig. The dovetails prevent the camera from sliding back far enough, and the matte box doesn't allow the camera to rotate enough to step out, and as a whole, it just is kind of problematic. So, with that said, is there a better option out there for a base plate for an R5C? Well, maybe. But that's also the big part of what makes building this kind of rig so frustrating and time-consuming, and potentially expensive for that matter. You have to find the right solution from a sea of options, and I found an option that I thought looked good, and it works well now that I've kind of tuned into it, but it was not the smoothest course of action. Now, of course, you can't talk about rods and rod-based rigs and hot rod rigs without talking about how you get all of this mounted on your tripod, because you still have to mount it there. Now, currently all of my tripod heads, at least my video ones, use Manfrotto 501 style plates, largely because they're all Manfrottos. So that's what I used. Now, I tried every plate I own, every one of these style plates, looking for the longest plate that would stick out as far as possible in front of the base plate to allow me to balance all of this on my video head. In the end, I ended up using a regular 140mm long Manfrotto 501 PL long plate. Now, a better option might be the 180mm long Manfrotto 504P long RL, but I don't have one of those, and they're almost $100, and I figured I'd just try to get by without it. Now, if your tripod does support it, because there are some out there, airy dovetails. This Tilta base has an airy dovetail quick release mount that's built into the bottom of the plate. And that would be a great solution. They're beefy, they're stiff, they're awesome. However, our dovetail plates, if you don't have them already, are expensive. And I don't have any heads that use them, so it would be mounting that dovetail plate to another plate on my, that mounts to my heads, and that's another plate-on-plate setup that I didn't really want to do. Now, that said, balancing this actually turned out to be not that much of an issue, thanks to the fact that I have that Manfrotto adapter plate under the camera, which allows me to move the camera forward and backwards in the rig on the base plate. And it was way easier to balance than I expected. In fact, that's maybe a hidden benefit of doing this and having that clamp to clamp to clamp thing. Now, that brings me to the rods themselves. 15mm diameter rods come in stainless steel, aluminum, and carbon fiber. Though aluminum and carbon fiber are what you're going to find most commonly, and they're made by both budget and premium brands, so you can find them at all kinds of different price points. Now, of these, carbon fiber is the lightest and is, of course, a very stiff material, but it is somewhat expensive and lacks modularity. Stainless steel is the strongest of these options, but it is also the heaviest and most expensive, and it's probably massively overkill for a lightweight, mirrorless, hybrid-sized rig. Finally, aluminum is reasonably light, and it's the least expensive of the three options. And interestingly enough, usually can be joined together with a coupler to lengthen the rod if you happen to need a longer rod for your setup and you don't happen to have a 16-inch one or something like that. So for my rig, I went with aluminum, mostly because it's the cheapest option, but also it's more than adequate to support my gear. Now, sure, carbon fiber would save a little bit on weight, but the pair of 12-inch rods that I'm using on my setup right now only weighs 154 grams total, and I don't want to pay twice as much for maybe 3/4 the weight, half the weight. I don't actually know what the carbon fiber rods would save me in terms of weight. Now, for the specific rods that I have, I bought SmallRig 6-piece set. It comes with 2 8-inch rods, 2 12-inch rods, and a pair of couplers to join them together to give you one 20-inch rod if you happen to need a 20-inch rod. Now, the 12-inch rods are just about perfect for my 24-105 setup, and the 8-inch rods are basically the right size for all of my shorter lens setups, so having both made a lot of sense to me. Moreover, the kit came with those couplers, so I can screw the 2 rods together and create a 20-inch long rod, which could be useful if I ever put this on a shoulder rig. That's another place these rods show up. Or if I want, or when I get to that whole teleprompter thing that I want to end up building. Now, the rest of this rig is built out with stuff I already had, and I've talked about in previous R5C rig videos. But to just go over it quickly, the matte box is by SmallRig, and I find it works very well in this case, as there's actually about 33 millimeters of adjustment built in to the mount. So you can go between having the lens center, or having the center of the matte box's lens as little as 77.5 millimeters above the rod center to as much as 110.5 millimeters above the rod center. So there's a lot of flexibility for these kinds of errors that I've been talking about. Now, the follow focus here is an older model SmallRig F40. It's mounted with its single rod clamp that it comes with, but SmallRig does have a quick release dual rod clamp available for it if that is something that you are interested in, and I think it's only like $30 or $35, so it's not terribly expensive. Now, with that said, I'm going to wrap this one up with this thought. Truth be told, adding rods to my rig isn't all that I imagined it would be. At least not yet, though maybe not ever. The ultimate goal here for me, at least, is to replace the big heavy teleprompter that I have with something that's much lighter and collapsible. But that said, finding or building that right, easily portable teleprompter is probably a story for another day. And until I do that, the rods are kind of a little bit of overkill. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.